Welcome to Adventures in Theater History. Here on this show, we try to bring you the best stories from the deep and fascinating history of theater in the city of Philadelphia. I'm Peter Schmitz, and our sound and original music are by Christopher Mark Colucci. We are plunging right into today's topic as we continue with our series of episodes about the history of censorship and public controversy on the Philadelphia stage. February 1936. As America was struggling through the Great Depression, everyone was increasingly aware of the persistence of deep poverty throughout the nation. In cities such as Philadelphia, for instance, which, like many other cities, was hard hit by the prolonged economic downturn. But there was also the matter of rural poverty, which the New Deal programs of President Franklin Roosevelt were trying to alleviate. This was reflected in the plays being written in that era too, and there were many folk dramas exploring rural poverty, especially in the American South, that were having a bit of a vogue. And we're not just talking about the WPA Theater Project. Even in the commercial theater, one of the most popular serious Broadway dramas of the time was a play called Tobacco Road by Jack Kirkland, based on the 1932 novel of the same name by Erskine Caldwell. Tobacco Road took place in the deep backwoods of rural Georgia, and it depicted the story of the family of a dirt farmer named Jeter Lester, and all the poverty, squalor, and grotesque tragic lusts and avarice that sprang from that situation. There was a lot of frank talk about sex and desire and food and everything else that was basic to human life. Folks in the world of the play tended to get married at the age of 12 or 13, and they would live a hard life, and they would die poor. In the end of the play, the reader or the audience can see a certain beauty and dignity and humanity to the family story, and although the work had its critics, a lot of people liked it a good deal. And the acting of the original cast was apparently top rate, and many people mentioned especially the actor Henry Hull, who played Jeter Lester. The original New York production ran on Broadway for a total of 3,182 performances, surpassing the record for a sustained run formerly held by that old standby of the 1920s, Abbey's Irish Rose. Here's a sound clip from the 1941 Hollywood movie that was eventually made of the play, where young Love Benzie comes to the Lester family's yard to complain that his new wife, Pearl, their youngest daughter, won't sleep in his bed or even talk to him, even though, well, he's tried beating her and throwing stuff at her. Doesn't work. They offer him instead her hair-lipped sister, the sensuous Ellie Mae.
Well, her not talking ain't anything to get mad about. Why, Eddie here never spoke a word to me for the first 10 years we was married. And them was the happiest 10 years of my life.
She runs away, too. I'm getting sick and tired of the whole business.
Give her time, boy. She'll be all right. She ain't but 13, remember.
You listen to me, Love Benzie. If you don't like what she's doing, you just bring her back home and get yourself another wife.
You can have Ellie Mae.
Oh, every time I say anything, you all want me to marry Ellie Mae. Well, it ain't no use. That's all there is to it. I want a young wife. I ain't gonna take no 23-year-old woman for a wife. Have everybody laughing at me.
Hey, love.
Yo, Ellie Mae.
Now, this film version is a bit cleaned up from the original theatrical script. Remember that Hollywood, unlike Broadway, in the 1930s actually was working under an official self-imposed censorship code. Now, amazingly, the 1936 road company of the play Tobacco Road, this stark show about the lowly rural poor, which had been banned in Boston and Chicago, was booked into the glittering new Forest Theater on Walnut Street. and Philadelphia audiences were ready to find out what all the fuss had been about up in New York. But not everybody in Philly was happy about this, it seems, because an urgent telegram arrived on the desk of the superintendent of the Philadelphia Police Department.
Tobacco Road is scheduled to open at the Forest tonight. Stop. I understand this play, acclaimed for its lack of reticence, its frank earthiness, and animalistic naturalness, was put out of Boston. Stop. Somebody had said that if the play is staged here, as printed in word and actions, then future generations will look back and avow we had lost our reason. Stop.
The telegram was signed John W. Keogh, 3745 Spruce Street. Now this apparently was Father Keogh, the pastor of St. Bede's Chapel of the University of Pennsylvania, who was also the head of the Philadelphia Catholic Total Abstinence Union. Though, as we shall see in 1936, the censorship of plays performed in the city of Philadelphia was once again the responsibility of an official board of censors. Nobody from that board actually went out and made it their business to attend every play and look for smut, like they did back in the 20s. In the 30s, that job was handed over to the squad on the Philadelphia police force that, among its other duties, regularly visited the city's theaters. So, responding to this telegram, the superintendent called the captain of detectives, John J. Creedon, and Captain Creedon immediately put his best man on the job, Sergeant Jacob Gambaro. Gambaro was a well-known figure in the Bureau of Public Safety. He often escorted visiting celebrities around the city, as well as keeping watch on possible subversive political organizations. Gambaro had a keen eye for unseemliness at the theater and would officially inform the producers of touring shows that certain lines or jokes had to be cut while they played in Philadelphia. Anyway, that kind of stuff might work in New York, he would tell them, but not here. Nonetheless, over his many years of doing this duty, Gambaro had seen a lot of theater and had developed an appreciation for good drama, and he called things as he saw them. His report on the Theater Guild's production of Tobacco Road was on the superintendent's desk the very next day, and it read, quote, "In accordance with your instructions, I attended the performance of Tobacco Road, playing at the Forest Theater on the evening of February 10th, 1936, occupying seat N110. The play was presented by the very strong cast, headed by Henry Hull in the role of Jeter Lester, and very ably supported by Mary Servos as the wife Ada Lester. The audience was the typical first-nighter, comprised of the people prominent in Philadelphia, well-known businessmen, lawyers, and doctors, who undoubtedly came to see a much heralded play, which received so much publicity, having been stopped in Boston and Chicago. In my opinion, this play does not intend to portray lewdness or obscenity, or even suggestiveness, as was intended in other plays I have reviewed. With the exception of the acting on the part of the sister Bessie Rice, the rest of the cast ably assisted Henry Hull in one of the finest and best dramatic acting I have had the occasion to review. During the intermissions, I contacted several persons whose opinions are usually respected, and I learned from one who had seen the show in New York that a number of lines that would be considered objectionable to a Philadelphia audience had already been eliminated. To one whom I spoke who comes from the South, the opinion was given that it was an exaggerated portrayal of actual conditions, but all agreed that the acting was superb. The performance started at 8:45 p.m. and was over by 11:15 p.m. Respectfully submitted, Jacob H. Gambaro, Detective Sergeant. So, having received that official all-clear, and I guess much to the shock and disappointment of Father Keogh, the run of Tobacco Road went on as scheduled during its week at the Forest Theater, and it then moved on to the Chestnut Street Opera House on the next block for an additional week. The papers of Jacob H. Gambaro, by the way, including many of his reports of the Philadelphia plays in the 1930s, were donated to the Temple University Library by his family and can be found in its collection. Now, in that year we're discussing today, 1936, Philadelphia had just gotten another new mayor, Republican S. Davis Wilson. In the mid-1930s, the voters of Philadelphia, which had formerly been a solid GOP city, were turning towards the Democratic Party. The New Deal of FDR and its efforts to pull the country out of the Great Depression were wildly popular with the city's working and middle classes. Back in the November 1935 mayoral election, Wilson had only beaten the popular and charismatic John B. Kelly by a very slim margin. But still, once he won, he called himself the People's Mayor. Now, let's take a look at S. Davis Wilson for a minute. He was originally from Boston and had a fairly interesting, though not a distinguished, past. As a young man up in Vermont, he was once an agent of the state armory, and in the course of his duties, he'd even shot another man to death. Self-defense, he always maintained. In 1905, Wilson came down to Philadelphia, and he stumbled around from job to job for over 2 decades. He was a bit of a loner. He had no real friends to speak of, no close associates. And by the age of 45, he was still largely unsuccessful, quite frustrated in his ambitions and desperately longing for some sort of fame and recognition. In 1926, he got a $5 a day job working for a temperance citizens group, the Lord's Day Alliance, ferreting out sites of illegal drinking during the sesquicentennial exhibition. And he used that as a stepping stone to get a job as an assistant to the Philadelphia City Comptroller. Now, from this minor bureaucratic post, Wilson finally began to get noticed. His boss did not want to be in the public eye, so Wilson took over that part. He finally began to make headlines, mostly through official clashes with the Philadelphia Rapid Transit, the private business that controlled all the subways and trolleys in the city. Wilson learned how to get the attention of reporters, and after that, he was rarely out of the newspapers for a single day for the rest of his life. He made good copy. He was loud and he was controversial. He would call crooked politicians dirty rats to their faces during public meetings. Wilson became a Democrat just long enough to get elected comptroller himself, and then he switched back to the Republican Party when he decided to run for mayor. The old, corrupt Protestant GOP cabal that had run the city for decades now was still a majority, barely a majority, but still a clear majority over the white Catholics and Jews and the growing black population that was turning to the Democrats. So, to gain the support of the wealthy industrialists that funded the GOP, Wilson blasted Roosevelt's New Deal. He even threw in a little anti-Semitism into the campaign. Still, it's likely that he actually won the mayor's office because Mort Wilkins, the old political boss of the 13th Ward along the Delaware, had dumped 30,000 ballots for his opponent, Kelly, into the river. But once he became mayor on January 6, 1936, Davis Wilson quickly turned on the GOP. He became a political independent and made increasingly populist ploys to gain further public favor. He attacked the transit system magnates again and again. He tussled with the politicians who controlled the city gas company. He courted the National Democratic Party to bring its presidential convention to Philadelphia. He got the Army-Navy football game to be permanently played here in the city stadiums. And here we finally get back to theater history once again. He reinstituted the old Philadelphia Board of Theatrical Control, which had been abolished 4 years before. Now, this move was popular in the sense that it was ostensibly to promote Philadelphia as a theater town. The Depression had seen a huge drop-off in the number of Broadway shows coming through the city. Most of Philadelphia's grand theater spaces, including all the ones that had sprung up during the previous 50 years of prosperity, were sitting empty much of the time. So this new Board of Theatrical Control was urged by Mayor Wilson not to concentrate on eliminating smut on the stage. Sergeant Gombro and the others would take care of that. But instead, to work to stimulate public interest in going to the theater. get the local colleges to bring in classes of students in huge groups, stuff like that. And to further this end, Wilson recruited some prominent society ladies who were active in the Philadelphia theater world, including Mrs. Rosa DeYoung, Mrs. Elizabeth Craven, and the beautifully named Mrs. Upton Favorite, an active supporter of the Plays and Players Theater Group, the Theater Guild, and the American Theater Society. She was, of course, also a member of the Charlotte Cushman Club, whose charitable activities we described in an episode last year. Mrs. Favorite was a strikingly tall, erudite, and elegant woman, and she was quite different from the other members of the Board of Censors we have met in the past. Mayor Wilson did make sure that other more reliable functionaries, like his personal assistant Louis Wilgard, were also on the panel. But the other big difference this time was that the mayor had formed it not to take controversial matters off his desk, to avoid being held responsible for anything going on in the theater world, because, as we mentioned, Wilson wanted public attention. He wanted public controversy. Like many other populist American politicians of that day, like, say, Huey Long down in Louisiana, Wilson thrived on it. And as it turned out, unlike all the other mayors up to now, Wilson really liked going to the theater. He and his wife went to every show that came through town. He was one of those regular first-nighters. He even told the producers of a show called 3 Men on a Horse, which was running at the Garrick Theater in April of 1936, that, hey, they could use his name in its publicity if they wanted to. And so it happened. Mayor Wilson says, "I want to see it again," the show's newspaper ads proclaimed. But Wilson could also take a violent dislike to shows that he saw, too, and sometimes for a very personal reason. Turns out, for example, that a cousin of his, named Martin Jones, had become a successful millionaire. Now, Cousin Martin got on Davis Wilson's nerves, especially when he started using some of his well-earned money to finance the tours of Broadway shows. One of the first shows that Martin Jones brought down to Philly was a comic revue called New Faces of 1936. Now, this review was not one of the ones we talked about in the last episode that was filled with musical numbers and chorus girls. New Faces of 1936 was an evening of sketch comedy featuring some great New York performers like the Duncan sisters and, interestingly, also Imogene Coca, a fantastically talented physical comedian who came from Philadelphia, as it happened. Imogene Coca had a great bit where, as an incompetent burlesque dancer, she would attempt to do a striptease, but then consistently fail to actually remove any item of her clothing, and only after a great deal of hilarious struggle, by the very end of her act, only one single glove would finally come off, to her amazement and pleasure, and to the audience's sustained laughter. The other comedians on the bill, the Duncan sisters, also did a hilarious skit about America's first ladies, the wife of the former president, Herbert Hoover, and the wife of the current president, Franklin Roosevelt, the redoubtable Eleanor Roosevelt. In this particular skit, Mrs. Hoover and Mrs. Roosevelt were portrayed as becoming the leaders of a Girl Scout troop, and they were trying to instruct their little charges on how to be prepared for everything in life, including, well, marriage and motherhood. Now, this review had run in New York to great success, and the Roosevelt family's grown children had seen the show and loved that skit, and everybody laughed. But when S. Davis Wilson saw it, all hell broke loose. Here's how the opening night was covered in the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I'll ask Chris to give me that old-timey sound quality again as I read to you the item from November 10th, 1936 in the Philadelphia Inquirer, page 21, if you want to go look for yourself. The headline was, "Mayor Plays Gallant, Bans Girl Scout Skit, Calls Play Showing Mrs. Roosevelt Talking on Babies a Damnable Outrage." A review called New Faces opened at the Forest Theater last night and was doing all right until the unprogrammed but not so new face of Mayor S. Davis Wilson burst suddenly upon the scene. The Girl Scout skit was on. Actors representing Mrs. Hoover and Mrs. Roosevelt were shown haranguing the girls on the delicate subject of babies. One tagline followed another. The audience laughed and waited for the blackout. Instead, Mayor Wilson suddenly entered center, although there was no cue for him. He rose from his place in the audience and came charging up the aisle. "It's a damnable outrage," he exclaimed, "to poke fun at the president's wife." Lawrence Schubert Lawrence, manager of the theater, materialized. "Put a stop to this at once," the mayor demanded. "Take that skit out, or I'll stop the whole show." Lawrence protested. Martin Jones, the producer, protested. Leonard Silman, the author, came up to protest too and said Mrs. Roosevelt's 3 sons had howled their heads off at the skit. The review ran 7 months in New York without a murmur, the mayor was informed. "Never mind," he reported grimly. "That skit can't happen here." "What about Mrs. Hoover?" someone wanted to know. "That's an outrage too," the mayor decided audibly. "But both President Roosevelt and Mrs. Roosevelt know all about the skit, and they think it's funny," producer Jones declared. "Jim Farley liked it. Look, we have quotes from him in our advertising." "Never mind," the mayor repeated. "Either the skit goes or the show goes." Threats of bringing in the American Civil Liberties Union failed to sway him. Quotations from critics failed to move him. Mutterings that it was all a publicity stunt for his honor's benefit failed to shake him. So, everybody capitulated. Tonight, the Girl Scout skit won't be in the show, whether the Roosevelts thought it was funny or not. February 1937. Mayor S. Davis Wilson had another problem with another touring show. He heard from his assistant, Louis Wilgard, about a production of the Langston Hughes play Mulatto, a Tragedy of the Deep South. Wilgard had seen the play in New York, and he thought it was indecent. Now, although he hadn't seen the play himself, Mayor Wilson was inclined to take his assistant's word for that, because once again his cousin, Martin Jones, was the producer, and Jones had booked the Locust Street Theater to host the show just a few blocks south of City Hall. He could see it out the window. Well, for many reasons, Mayor Wilson was suspicious, including that Mulatto was about interracial sex. Now, like a lot of white folks back then, Wilson just had a complete horror of what was termed miscegenation, and he saw this as another opportunity to take one of his quixotic public stands that would immediately get him into the newspaper. Mulatto had played in New York City at several theaters from October of 1935 through September of 1936. Its 373 performances were the most for a Broadway play written by any black playwright ever, a record that would stand for the next 20 years. Now, admittedly, the show itself, as produced, was not quite the one that Langston Hughes had originally written. As was the common practice of that day, Martin Jones had added sensationalistic language and extra action to stoke controversy and gather public attention. But to Mayor Wilson's mind, the play had enough provocative content already, since its central story was a long-standing relationship between a white plantation owner in the South and his black housekeeper. At the beginning of the play, we learn that the couple have 4 grown children, and the resulting struggle between whether these children should pass as white or claim their heritage as African American provided the play with lots of violent conflict, and in the long run, spoiler alert, ends with one of the sons strangling his father to death and then being pursued by a white lynch mob. The show had been widely praised by critics for its writing, and it had been produced in Chicago and Atlantic City recently without incident. But Mayor Wilson was evidently convinced, or wanted to be convinced, that he was stopping a potential race riot by banning the play. He thought this was the Klansmen all over again. Now, local black leaders and journalists all publicly stated that this was nonsense. There was no public outcry amongst their community against the play, and folks knew that this was another plantation melodrama, but it was a very far cry from being anything like Thomas Dixon's The Klansman, after all. However, Mayor Wilson was not to be persuaded, and he deemed its themes too incendiary. "The show won't go on," he told newspapermen, claiming it was an outrageous affront to decency. Nevertheless, to do things all legally on the up and up, he convened a 6-person review board, made up mostly of members of the Board of Theatrical Control, which at that point included both a rabbi and a black minister, to watch a special performance of the play on Monday afternoon and vote on whether to let it proceed that Monday evening. Well, after seeing the show, the board voted, and it split 3-3, with Mrs. Upton Favorite, the rabbi, and the minister, sounds like the beginning of a joke, doesn't it, wanting to approve it. But Wilson then used his official power to step in. He simply summarily relieved Mrs. Upton Favorite of her post, and since that made the vote 3-2, Wilson was able to officially ban any further public performance of the play. Martin Jones made a visit to a local judge, but the ruling came down that the mayor was completely within the law on this matter. The show would not go on. One of the clearest instances of a controversial play just being totally banned in Philadelphia as I can find. There is a postscript to the story. 2 years later, in December of 1939, Martin Jones again attempted to bring another production of Mulatto to Philadelphia, and this time he had rented the Walnut Street Theater. But by that point, Mayor S. Davis Wilson was not only no longer in office, he had died earlier in that year at the age of 58 after suffering a stroke. But his successor, the now acting mayor, George Connell, upheld Wilson's original policy and reinstated the ban on Mulatto. Now, the Walnuts manager, Joseph Becker, sought a restraining order against Connell, but again, a local judge ruled it was well within the mayor's power, according to the law. And that ban, ladies and gentlemen, has been very effective, even long after the era of censorship has ended. To this date, Langston Hughes Mulatto, to my knowledge, has never received a professional production in the city of Philadelphia. And that was really the last of the era's big censorship controversies. Oh, there was a kerfuffle about a play called Spirochete, done by the WPA Theater Project in 1939. The Knights of Columbus objected to the play's insinuation that Christopher Columbus was responsible for the spread of the disease syphilis. And in 1945, another Philadelphia Protestant minister got all bent out of shape about yet another miscegenation play called Strange Fruit. But it didn't end up getting banned, and that was pretty much it. As we get into the 1940s, 50s, and the 60s, as we shall see, there are some other fun and fascinating disputes, but they have a different tone on the whole. Social mores and censorship laws were changing. After all, there were much less moral crusades and no more censorship boards. By the end of the Second World War, that was pretty much over. Even the darkest parts of the McCarthy era, and there were some dark parts in the 1950s, didn't really reach the theater world that much. That was mostly in television and the movies. And any further disputes about the historical reputation of Christopher Columbus in Philadelphia would also get left for another day in this century, when, as you may have heard, he'd become part of the cultural wars of our own era. Well, that's our show for today. Thank you so much. But before we go, hey, we have a favor to ask. We need your feedback. Would you write to us? Just send us a quick email. Tell us why you tuned in, why you keep tuning in, what you're particularly enjoying about the show, or what you'd like to know more about. And maybe you can suggest something that we've missed so far. We'd love to hear from you. Our email is aithpodcast@gmail.com. Or you can contact us via our website, aithpodcast.com. Second, there's another way you can help us out. Find our Patreon account. There's a link in our show notes. We'll see you again in a couple of weeks when we have a special interview subject coming up. Look for that. And then once that's over, we'll wrap up this series about censorship and municipal politics in Philadelphia during the month of May 2023 when our Season 2, Drama is Conflict, will at last be complete. So long for now. Thank you so much for listening today and for coming along on another adventure in theater history, Philadelphia.